When Black Lives Matter established itself as a movement in America, we witnessed the white supremacist agenda steal that slogan and then twist it into All Lives Matter as a kind of reaction to the existence of Black Lives Matter. It was their way of stealing what Black Americans had created and then twisting it into their own slogan in order to derail the very serious conversations that Black Americans were trying to have to achieve justice. In the same vein, that is happening with Palestine, because there is the recognizable cry for a free Palestine. And then there are people who see that and are so disturbed that Palestinians have the audacity to call for freedom. So they steal that catchphrase as a means to be reactionary, and they decide to hashtag Free Israel, which is fascinating to me because I don't disagree, but not for the reasons that they would anticipate. Because when these people shout Free Israel as a reaction to Palestinians calling for justice, what they actually mean when they say Free Israel is they mean Free Israel from the existence of Palestinians. Free Israel, in their head, comfortably is synonymous with the genocide of Palestinians. But when I hear Free Israel, I actually think about Israelis. Like when people call for a free Palestine, they are calling for a physical change to the realities of Palestinians, breaking down the walls, the checkpoints, the constant raids on their houses of worship, the siege that does not allow them to eat freely or drink freely. They are calling for a physical freedom. But when you sit back and you genuinely think about what it is that Israelis need to become free from, the only answer that doesn't involve a genocide of a people is indoctrination, militarization, white supremacy, and being used as tools to commit war crimes on behalf of a fascist regime. That is what I think about when I think about what Israelis need to become free of. You see, I cannot be bothered to address the modern-day settlers. I cannot be bothered with people who were born in different countries and then actively made the decision to continue a colonial project. But there are actual human beings that were born in Israel. Their parents were born in Israel. Their grandparents enacted a great violence to achieve the reality of Israel. They had no other option but to contend with the reality that they were born into. As far as I'm concerned, there are two main groups of Israelis that define the current generation. All born Israelis go through the same process of indoctrination. Of course, they are emotionally indoctrinated, constantly forced to contend with the trauma of their grandparents, constantly being reminded of that brutal history, and constantly being reminded of their duty to never let that happen again. And then they are mentally indoctrinated to believe that their existence, their human existence, is significantly more valuable, significantly more important than any other human being. So these Palestinians who are crying for their human rights don't actually deserve human rights because they are lesser than. They don't matter. Not when you are an Israeli Jew who is a direct descendant of people who survived one of the most brutal genocides that we have witnessed in our history. And then they are entered into the final stage of indoctrination, which is obviously militarization. They do not have a choice. They have to be militarily trained. They all have to learn physical combat, and they all have to perfect their aim as they practice for the eventual day that they are going to be persecuting Palestinians. Now, within that group of born Israelis who simply had to exist and absorb all the indoctrination that they were forced to live through, there are two results. There is the Israeli who smiles when he shoots his first Palestinian. There is the Israelis who laugh as they brutalize groups of Palestinian children. There are the Israelis who chuckle at the cries of Palestinian women. These are the scariest Israelis. And then there are the Israelis who, after all of that indoctrination, all of that militarization, have to go on their first mission into Palestinian territory. And the very first act of oppression that they are forced to commit against a Palestinian horrifies them. These are the Israelis who stayed so connected to their humanity despite the indoctrination that when they are actually asked to commit an act of violence against a fellow human being, they falter. These are the Israelis who all of a sudden are dealt a brutal blow to reality, because their entire world, everything that they thought to be true, is actually torn down right before their very eyes. And they have to contend with the disturbing reality that they are monsters in the eyes of Palestinian children. These Israelis are some of the most important people that exist right now. And I know it's hard and scary, but these are the Israelis that I need to be the absolute loudest right now. You are 3 generations into a land that is only yours because your grandparents enacted a great violence against people who exist today. You have the privilege, the capacity, the positionality to create a new reality. If you stand loudly with Palestinians now, you will be able to create a movement and shift the entire land towards a long-lasting peace, a peace that will never be within reach again if the genocide of the Palestinians is carried out to completion. Now is the time to stand on the right side of history.
In this video, I'm going to explain to you why I keep seeing Palestinians being called barbaric, savage terrorists. So we're in the late 1800s, and there's a lot of anti-Semitism going on in Europe. This anti-Semitism leads to the creation of a movement called Zionism. Zionism was basically the belief that Jewish people needed their own state. So they went to Argentina, they went to Uganda, but ultimately they decided on Palestine. Who was in Palestine? Palestinians, who were not just Muslims, by the way. They were Christians, Jews, Muslims, but they were all identified as Palestinians living in this land. Palestinians who were already under British rule saw this influx of Jewish immigration into Palestine and the whole concept of Zionism, we want to create a Jewish state and exclude the Palestinians, as a threat to their own sovereignty. So in 1917, the British signed this document called the Balfour Declaration, which basically said, yes, the Jewish people are going to get their state, we're going to help them, and fuck the Palestinians, basically. And after one of the most horrific events in history, the Holocaust, there was obviously a great influx of Jewish immigration into Palestine once again. So from the early 1900s until 1948, there was a double colonization happening to the Palestinian people. There was, first of all, just the British presence there, and then there was the mass Jewish immigration that was funded by the British with no regards to Palestinian sovereignty. And in 1948, the Nakba happened. The Nakba, which means catastrophe in Arabic, was the ethnic cleansing of almost 1 million Palestinians, including my grandfather. And since 1948, Palestinians have been 2 things: stateless and living under a military occupation in Palestine. Palestinians want equal rights in their historic homeland, but they have not been afforded this right since 1948. 75 years of land theft, 75 years of oppression, 75 years of no rights for Palestinians. And naturally, like history will show you, resistance movements started popping up, including Hamas, which was actually funded by Israel in the 1990s. Since 1948, Palestinians have not been afforded the right to context. Think about the representation of Arabs in movies. We're either in a pack and there's no faces and there's an American hero and he's just trying to kill all of us because we're dumb. Or it's the rich sheikh that has 17 wives. And Hollywood and American media has created this narrative that Palestinians just come out of their mother's wombs and we just want to kill Israelis. We're not afforded the right to context. We're not afforded the right to talk about these 75 years of oppression that we've been going through. We're not afforded this right because American media just wants to dehumanize Palestinians so that normal people, when they see, it's like, oh, they just are terrorists, they're barbaric, they want to kill Jews, and oh my God. When in reality, it's been 75 years of oppression and military occupation. 75 years. So as you navigate the news these days and you see that Palestinians are savage terrorists, we're barbaric, just keep in mind our fight for freedom and justice over the past 75 years.
If you say, I'm not anti-Jews, I'm anti-Zionists, who do you think Zionists are?
Hi, I'm Quinn and I'm an anti-Zionist Jew. Zionist Jews have gotten really, really good at making this conflict and this crisis an issue of anti-Semitism. That's not what it is. The way they spin it, if you don't support Israel, if you don't support the right of Jewish people to establish an ethno-state on currently occupied land, you're a Nazi, you're anti-Semitic, you're blowing dog whistles, you want Jewish people to die. Not true. This conflict, this crisis is not about religion. It's about land. Before Zionism had ever come into the mainstream political sphere, before Israel was ever created, before the Holocaust, before all of it, Jews, Muslims, and Christians all lived in Palestine. Palestine was not a Muslim country. The land is spiritually relevant to almost all major religions. And up until the proliferation of Zionism and the establishment of the Israeli state, all major religions with ties to the land were represented in the population of Palestine. The issue arose after the Holocaust. There was a mass immigration of Jews from Europe to Palestine, and eventually it became a mainstream political party and political ideology to believe that Jews were owed ownership of the land. It didn't matter what other religions were spiritually connected to the land should be owned by Jewish people. And Zionists make this about anti-Semitism. They are forcing you to pick either anti-Semitism or Islamophobia. It's inherently violent, it's an inaccurate portrayal of the conflict, and it's a bastardization of Judaism. Using Judaism and the atrocities of the Holocaust to justify and inform settler colonial violence is a slap in the face to the entire faith, a perversion of what Judaism teaches us.
Especially as President Biden has now committed to humanitarian efforts.
I'm gonna need you to be so fucking for real right now. Because that is the most ironic delulu shit that I've ever heard in my life, because who is actually believing any of that nonsense? You mean to tell me that Biden's sending humanitarian aid over to help people in Gaza while simultaneously sending over the world's biggest warship and a bunch of troops and bombs that are being rained down and killing thousands of Palestinians, men, women, children, babies? But then you're going to also send a measly little 2 ships with 1,000 beds on them to help the people because you are so kind and gracious and such a great humanitarian. Oh my god, the best humanitarian ever, who funds genocides and then sends over little tiny bandages and to make things better. Please, who are you fooling right now? You want to be humanitarian? Let me tell you how you could be humanitarian. It's just one little thing you gotta do. Stop funding Israel. Stop sending stuff over. It's the amount of utter, I don't even know what to call it.
At college campuses, with folks showing up to support both Jewish students and the Palestinian people.
How disappointing you continue to be. There are countless Jewish people showing up for Palestinian rights right now, so to break those two groups of protesters as Jewish versus Palestinian when it's pro-Israel versus Palestinians, refugees, people under extreme bombardment, for you to go on to play the audio of a Zionist and then use passive language to discuss the thousands of Palestinians who have been murdered due to atrocity propaganda. Sometimes you have to recognize you are not the one to be talking about a situation. You are not trained in any of these contexts. Therefore, you are not the person to create the language around how we talk about these things and what sources of information we share. Please sit down.